Dare to Prevail Part 2, Parallel World, Book 5, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 16. Over the next 3 days, whenever Nick went somewhere, he set the alarm. Not that he left more than a few times. Amy and I began to feel like prisoners in his house. On Friday, Nick and I spent the morning practicing how I would respond to questions from the media during the news conference. He told me that the news conference would begin with me making a statement, and he helped me write it out. Anxious to know how much time Amy and I had before we had to get out, I asked, "Have you scheduled it yet?" He glanced at me. "Not yet, but I'll be sure to give you enough warning." What he considered enough and what I considered enough were probably two entirely different things, but I couldn't very well tell him that without arousing his suspicion. We continued with our practice, and it wasn't until Nick said we'd done enough that I brought up the idea of sharing the alarm code with me. "Why do you need it?" he asked as he straightened his desk. "What if something happens and Amy and I need to open the door? We don't want to set off the alarm." "I'm usually here, though." He frowned. "I don't really see a need for you to have it." I could see my roundabout way of asking was getting me nowhere, and though I preferred to avoid confrontations, I didn't see any other way to get what I needed. "To be honest, Amy and I kind of feel like prisoners here. I mean, are we allowed to go anywhere?" He laughed. "The alarm isn't to keep you in, it's to keep enforcers out, along with anyone else who might want to do you harm. I don't think I need to remind you that you're a wanted person, Morgan." No, he didn't need to remind me, although now that nearly a week had gone by with no enforcers showing up to drag me away, I had kind of forgotten that real danger lurked just outside the walls of his house. "Still," I said, "what would it hurt to give me the code? It's not like I'm going to tell anyone." This seemed to stump him. "I'll think about it, okay?" That was something at least. Back in my room that afternoon, I reported this to Amy. "If he won't give it to you," she said, "then we'll just have to set it off when we leave. I mean, when he's not here." She paused. "What happens when the alarm goes off, anyway?" "I don't know." "I doubt if it calls the enforcers," she said. "So maybe it just tells him that someone set it off?" More and more, it seemed that Amy should be the one in charge of our escape. She had more experience than me and continued to surprise me with her insight. "That sounds about right," I said. "So, if Nick is far enough away, we could put some distance between us and his house before he could get back here." "Right," she smiled. "Next time he leaves us alone, let's make a break for it." As much as I liked her enthusiasm, taking the final step of going out there still terrified me. Somehow, I preferred the idea of it to the reality, but I didn't want to admit that to Amy. Besides, she thought I was DM, someone who would be eager to escape, someone who had already proven that escaping great danger was completely doable, even easy. "Yeah," I said, trying to put a confident smile on my face. The next morning at breakfast, Nick had a surprise announcement. "The news conference is today." "What?" I tried not to let my mouth fall open too much, but it was nearly impossible to hide my shock and terror. Today, I could be captured by enforcers. Today, I could face Holly and her torture device. Trembling, I stared at Nick. "Yesterday you told me you didn't know when it would be." My gaze shot to Amy, who looked just as stunned as I felt, then back to Nick. "I thought it best not to tell you yesterday." His face showed his empathy. "I can see you're worried, Morgan, which is exactly why I didn't tell you before. I knew you'd stress over it, and I didn't want you to worry unnecessarily. Better for you not to know until the last minute, don't you think?" No, I thought, but that explained why he'd spent so much time working with me on my answers the day before. He wanted my practice to be fresh in my mind. "What time will it be?" Maybe Amy and I could escape before we ever got close to the danger zone. 11 o'clock, so after breakfast we'll head over there to make sure we're ready." Too soon, I thought. It's too soon. No way Amy and I could escape now. We would have to come up with another plan. "I want Amy there," I said on impulse. "Yeah," she added. "I want to be there too." Nick looked from my face to hers and back again. "It will be dangerous, Amy. There's no guarantee the enforcers won't find you." He frowned. "I know you don't want to go back to Camp Willamos, or anywhere else they might take you." Shaken by his statement, her face paled, and I knew she was thinking of the enforcers taking her to Holly. "No," she said, "I don't." "You need to think about wanting to go then," Nick said. "You would be much safer here at the house." "Unless you're sending Mills to get her while I'm gone," I thought. "I need her with me," I said, knowing Amy would be in agreement, although having her there only added another layer of stress and fear. Nick appraised me. "Why? Do you really want to have to worry about her?" "I'll worry about her less if she's beside me," I thought. "Are you going to be there?" I asked instead. No, actually." "Where will you be?" Amy asked. Nick turned to her. "I have some other business to take care of." He didn't know I told Amy I was supposed to be a distraction so he and some other mysterious people could do the actual damage, whatever that was going to be. "Who's going to be there with us then?" I asked. "A few of my people will be with you." So I would finally meet more people involved in the resistance. That would be interesting. "Can I go with Morgan?" Amy asked. When Nick hesitated, I jumped in with an ultimatum. "If Amy doesn't go, I'm not going." Nick turned to me with surprise, then his expression changed, and I knew we'd won, although this win didn't feel especially victorious. "I suppose it might be useful for you to have her there." I had no idea if this was really the best thing. What if the enforcers captured both of us? But leaving her here without me didn't feel right either. "Can we have some time to get ready before we leave?" That way Amy and I could at least try to come up with a new plan. "You have 30 minutes. We need to get going as soon as possible." Amy and I immediately left the kitchen and went to our bedroom. "What are we going to do?" Amy asked the moment we were alone. I didn't have the first clue. I'd barely had any idea about what we would do once we left Nick's house if we managed to escape before this dreadful day. "Maybe we can leave now," I said, though I was doubtful that would actually work, "while Nick thinks we're getting ready." "Maybe," Amy said, but she didn't seem confident about it. "But he'll hear the alarm and catch us. Then he would know we want to escape." Of course she was right. "Then we need to escape as soon as we can after we get to wherever it is he's taking us." We changed as we talked, and Amy agreed to be in charge of the backpack. She added the flashlight to the matches, food, and water. "At least we'll be wearing coats when we go out," I said. Nick knocked on the bedroom door much too soon. "Are you girls ready?" he called through the door. I looked at Amy. She nodded, then I opened the door. Nick's eyes went to the backpack on Amy's shoulders. "What's in there?" "Just some stuff I want to bring," Amy said. He held out his hand. "Let me see it." Amy sighed, then gave it to him. He unzipped it and dug around, then looked at me with puzzlement. "Are you planning on going somewhere?" "What if something happens?" I asked. Scowling, he stared at me, then he shook his head. "Leave it. You won't need it. You're coming straight back here afterwards." He set it aside and motioned for Amy and me to exit our room. I glanced at Amy with a frown, then headed toward the garage. Chapter 17. As we left Nick's neighborhood, I felt invisible in the back seat of his car, the tinted windows feeling like a barrier from the enforcers who would find me. There weren't a lot of houses in the area, although there was a bus stop about a half-mile away. It felt good to see something besides the inside of Nick's house. 30 minutes later, we drove into a parking garage underneath a building. I didn't know this area at all. Not that that would help me anyway. My sense of direction was non-existent. I hoped Amy's was better than mine. "We're going to the 3rd floor," Nick said, as he escorted us through the empty garage and toward an elevator. "Where is everyone?" There were only a couple of cars parked in the stalls. "Today is Saturday, and this is an office building. Most people are off today." Had he planned a Saturday news conference from the beginning for that very reason? Fewer people who might see me? We stepped into the elevator, and Nick pressed the button for the 3rd floor. It was 10 o'clock. 1 hour until showtime. We entered a reception area that had a number of offices with closed doors. "We'll be in here," Nick said, as he ushered us into a conference room with several pieces of equipment laid out on a large table. 5 men I'd never seen before were in the room, and they all zeroed in on me. "How's it going?" Nick asked one of the men. "Like clockwork," the man said with a smile. "Morgan," Nick said as he turned to me. Then he gestured to the man. "This is Paul. He'll be in charge." "Hi," I said, wondering how hard it would be for Amy and me to sneak away from him. Although without our supplies, we would be at a disadvantage. "This is Morgan's sister, Amy," Nick said. Then he introduced the rest of the people in the room. "I'll leave you to it," he said to Paul. Then he turned to me. "Paul will tell you what to do. Just give the answers like we practiced." Now that this was upon me, panic became a living thing, growing inside me, telling me I was going to fail. What if Amy and I couldn't get away? What if I had to actually do the news conference? What if the enforcers found us and dragged us away? No outcome would be a happy one as far as I could tell. Nick must have seen the dread on my face because his voice became soothing. "Don't stress about it, Morgan. If they ask a question you don't know the answer to, just say you're not ready to answer that right now, okay?" Due to my sudden inability to speak, I nodded. He smiled with what was probably supposed to be encouragement. "Paul will make sure you're both safely returned to my house afterward." I remembered Nick's assumption that his people would be able to get their hands on an enforcer's radio. Without it, how would they know when our position had been found? My fear pushed the words past my frozen throat. "Did someone get an enforcer's radio?" His smile never wavered. "We're working on that now." That means no, I thought. My panic edged up a notch. "Try not to worry, Morgan. We have very competent people on top of this. We don't want anything to happen to you." I wasn't sure my safety was as important to them as it was to me. In the end, they would be more concerned about themselves, wouldn't they? Forcing a smile, I pretended that his words had comforted me. His smile grew. "Good luck. You can tell me how it went when I see you back at the house." Then he left. I glanced at Paul, but he and his team were focused on setting up their equipment. I turned to Amy with a frown. She raised her eyebrows at me, then said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I have to go to the bathroom." "I need to go too," I said. "I'll have someone accompany you," Paul offered. "No," I said. "I'm sure we can find it." He shook his head. "That's out of the question." Then he did a chin lift toward another man. "Scott, go with them." "Yes, sir," Scott said. Then he turned his attention to us. "This way, ladies." We followed him out of the room and down the hall to a women's restroom. Once inside, I turned to Amy. "How are we going to get away?" "I don't know," she said. "That guy's not going to let us go anywhere alone." "Maybe if they aren't paying attention to us, we can slip out," I said. She nodded. "Maybe, but what about the backpack? We don't have anything now." "I know," I said with a frown. "If we can get away, we'll deal with it then." Once we returned to the conference room, Paul told us to sit in the far corner, which was also the farthest point from the door. Then he announced that he'd stationed 2 men somewhere outside the conference room, which gave me mixed feelings. It would be next to impossible for us to sneak out, but it would also be hard for someone to sneak in. As 11 o'clock approached, nervousness made my stomach ache. Paul's men had set up a camera that would capture my image and stream it live to the media, who were several miles away waiting for me to appear. In addition, we could see an image of what was going on at that location. People milled about, evidently waiting for me to show up. I saw at least a dozen reporters and plenty of regular people. There were also enforcers, a lot of them. Trying to ignore the worry that gnawed at my mind, even as I accepted the inevitability of this news conference and my part in it, I asked, "Who's going to tell them I'm not coming?" "We hired a public relations person to set this up, and right before 11, he'll get the message from our team that we're doing this remotely instead. That's when he'll announce it to the media." For a moment, I became concerned about this nameless person. Would the enforcers arrest him? Torture him? I hoped not. "What's Nick doing?" I asked, hoping Paul might tell me something Nick had refused to. Paul frowned at me. "That's not your concern. You need to stay focused on your part in this." Sighing, I turned away from him. "It'll be fine," Amy whispered next to me as she put her hand on my arm. "Just tell the people what happened to you." Her reminder that I wasn't actually the one who had experienced what everyone thought I'd experienced sent my nerves tingling. Trying to think of something besides my fears, I stared at the large screen hanging on the wall, which showed clumps of enforcers encircling the area where they thought I was going to appear. This didn't help my fear, it heightened it. All those enforcers against Paul and his few men? There was no way they could hold them back. Heart pounding, ears ringing, my vision began to narrow to a pinpoint, and I feared I might pass out. I bent forward, hanging my head between my knees, trying to get blood to flow back to my brain. Breathing slowly and deeply, my vision began to clear, and the ringing in my ears stopped. How am I going to do this? I thought. "Morgan?" Amy asked. "Morgan, are you okay?" Slowly, I lifted my head and looked at my sister. She had complete confidence in my abilities, but that was only because she thought I was DM. Our eyes met, and I couldn't hide the utter terror that shone from my soul. "It will be okay," she said with a smile. "I'm right here with you." Slightly comforted, I nodded. Having her there definitely helped, although I knew it was ultimately up to me. "Okay, Morgan," Paul said. "Sit in this chair." The chair he pointed to had a camera and microphone situated directly in front of it. Though my legs felt like they were made of rubber, I forced myself to move to the chair, grateful that at least I would be sitting. If I had to stand, I was certain my legs wouldn't be able to hold me up. "The broadcast will begin in 5 minutes, one of the men said. We all turned to the large screen on the wall, and it seemed as if the number of enforcers had doubled. I guess Nick's getting what he wants, I thought, me as a distraction. The thought didn't bring me any satisfaction. Instead, I wondered what Nick was doing that was so important that he needed all the enforcers' attention turned toward me. "Did you get a radio?" I asked Paul as my panic edged further upward. "From an enforcer?" He looked at me with a smug smile. "Yeah, one of our men on the ground has one, and he'll relay any information we'll need." Relief blossomed within me. At least we would have some warning when they pinpointed our location. Paul pressed his earpiece to his ear. "Turn on the sound, Brandon." We heard someone speaking. "That's our PR guy," Paul said to me. "Not able to be here in person," he was saying. "Instead, Morgan Campbell will talk to you remotely." The camera was still focused on the crowd, and as the PR guy announced my absence, enforcers sprang into action. They broke into smaller groups, some going out of view, others walking toward the front of the venue to where the PR man stood. Still others stayed where they were and kept a close watch on the assembled crowd. "If you'll raise your hand," the PR man said to the reporters, "I'll call on you and you can ask your question. Ms. Campbell will then answer. But first, I'd like to give her an opportunity to make a statement." He paused. "Morgan." Here we go. My mouth had gone bone dry, but I forced myself to remain calm. Amy had slid into the seat beside me, out of range of the camera's lens, and I turned to see her smiling with encouragement. Never before had I appreciated my sister like I did at that moment. Paul nodded at me as a bright red light atop the camera came to life. Nick and I had practiced this, and I glanced at the sheet of paper we'd prepared. "Hello," I said, then cleared my throat. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming to talk to me today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but as you can imagine, it wouldn't be in my best interest to do so." I glanced at the camera before looking back at the paper. As most of you have seen in the video I recorded, my time in both Camps Willamoss and Stonewater was horrific. I was drugged, abused, and tortured by the very people who were there to supposedly help me. I glanced at the camera again, wondering what everyone was thinking, wondering if my family was watching this on television. Before I was forced to go to these federally assisted thinning centers, I'd had no idea how they really were. I'm sure most of you didn't have any idea either. I stared at the camera, finally feeling like I was speaking as myself. Now we all know how they are, and I hope you agree with me that they need to be closed down. No one deserves to be treated like that." I continued reading the statement Nick had helped me prepare, and then I answered several questions from the reporters. 15 minutes into the news conference, sudden movement caught my eye. I shifted my attention to Paul and saw him press his earpiece tight to his ear. "Okay," he said into a miniature radio. Then he looked at me. "They found us." Chapter 18. Paul's gaze shot to Brandon. "Cut it off." At his command, the camera's red eye went dark. "We need to leave, now." My heart went into a gallop. I knew this was a mistake, I thought. I knew it the moment Nick suggested it, and now they found me, found us. What am I going to do? What? Frozen with fear, when Amy jumped up and tugged on my arm, I couldn't move. This was all my fault. I was going to suffer worse than DM, and so would Amy. Bracing myself to be taken into custody, I heard buzzing in my ears as my vision narrowed to pinpoints. "Morgan!" Amy shouted from beside me. "Come on!" I turned my head and looked at her, but all I saw were black spots. I had to get myself under control, or we would all be doomed for sure. I inhaled a lungful of air before slowly exhaling, but that didn't help. "Let's go," Paul commanded as he yanked me out of my seat. On the brink of passing out, I let him and the other men drag me along, and moments later, we began descending the emergency staircase. "I hope Nick had time to do his thing," Brandon muttered to Paul. "Me too," Paul replied. Finally getting my fears under control, I managed to make my way down the stairs, and when we reached the door to the parking garage, Paul told us to wait. Then he motioned his men forward. Brandon and the other man went through the door, leaving Amy and me alone with Paul. We stayed silent, and a moment later, Paul pressed his finger to his earpiece before turning to us. "We're clear." Then he opened the door for us to go through. Terrified that enforcers were waiting for us on the other side, I held my breath, but took a step forward. Amy was right behind me, and Paul followed her. When the only person who met us was Brandon and the other man, my breath came out in a rush. "Scott said the exit is still clear," Paul said to the two men, "so we'll head that way." I remembered that Scott, who had accompanied Amy and me to the bathroom, was one of the men Paul had sent out earlier. Evidently, he was stationed near the exit to the parking garage. Knowing all of these people were looking out for Amy and me gave me a feeling of security, and I wondered if Amy and I had been too hasty in our decision to want to be on our own. Then I thought about the phone call I'd overheard. Mill's suggestion that Nick turn Amy over to Holly to appease her was terrifying. Would Nick do that? And now that the news conference was over, had I served my purpose? Was I now a liability? But I'd met 5 more members of the resistance, as had Amy. Did that mean Nick's trust in us had grown? Confused as to what we should do, I climbed into the back seat of the car like Paul told me to, and Amy got in beside me. Paul closed the door. Amy and I were alone. I looked out the window. Paul, Brandon, and the other man were talking. Their expressions were intense, and I wondered what they were saying. "We have to get out of here," Amy said. "Like, now." Yeah. At her words, an overwhelming need to flee welled up inside me. The enforcers knew our location. We had to go. Finally, Brandon got behind the wheel of our car, and Paul and the other man got in another. Without a word, Brandon started the engine and we surged forward. "Where are they going?" I asked as I watched the other car pull out ahead of us. "Put your seatbelts on," he said. Then he pulled up to the exit of the parking garage and paused. Amy and I quickly engaged our seatbelts. Scott appeared next to the car and climbed into the passenger seat. "We gotta move." His voice was calm, yet had an undercurrent of urgency. "They're almost on us." Brandon punched the gas, but it was too late. Enforcers roared around the corner. They were headed directly toward us. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," I thought. My gaze was riveted to the procession of vehicles that were now in our path. Brandon slammed on the brakes, then spun our car around so that we faced the other direction before gunning it. We sped off. I turned around as best as I could while wearing the seatbelt and looked out the rear window. "They're right behind us," I said to Amy, who sat rigid in her seat. Trying to distance myself from the horror of what was happening to me, chased by enforcers, I counted the number of cars following us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That only served to bring my simmering hysteria to a full boil. Pressing my hands to my mouth to hold in the scream that was clawing its way up my throat, I spun around and squeezed my eyes closed, attempting to blank out what was happening behind us. "They're going to catch us, Morgan," Amy whimpered. "Please don't let them catch us." We should have escaped from Nick's house sooner, I thought. It's all my fault. I should have left with Amy when we had the chance. Although I knew we never really had the chance, I couldn't stop the self-blame. I should have made the chance. I opened my eyes and looked at my younger sister. She was counting on me. I had to get her to safety. One way or another, I had to. Our car approached a corner, but more enforcers were coming from the side. We had nowhere to go, and I didn't dare count how many enforcers had joined the chase. "Hold on," Brandon shouted. Then he turned sharply to the left down a side street, then made a quick right. I swiveled in my seat, and for 5 seconds I couldn't see the enforcers. Then they were there. "I'm going to make a couple more sharp turns, and then you girls jump out with Scott, okay?" "Jump out?" I thought. "Out there?" "Okay," Amy said. "Everyone get out on the right, okay?" Scott said. Brandon made several more turns, and when he slammed on the brakes, I knew it was time. "Now!" he shouted. Amy threw open her door and leapt out. I was right behind her. Scott had already gotten out of his side. He shut the door to the back seat the moment I cleared it. Brandon peeled away and Scott yanked Amy and me behind a dumpster where the 3 of us ducked down. 3 seconds later, enforcer vehicles began flying past us. We froze in place until the last one passed. Then Scott stood. "Stay here." Adrenaline poured through my veins, but I held completely still, beyond ecstatic that we weren't on our own. We were in an alley behind a row of stores. I listened intently for the hint of an approaching car. Cold air and the stink of rotten garbage surrounded us, but I tried to ignore it as I focused on our survival. "Okay," Scott said as he squatted beside us several minutes later. "Here's what we're going to do. To make sure no one can track our location, I've had to go radio silent, but I know of a safe house a few miles from here. We just have to get there, and then I'll assess our next move." It sounded simple enough, except that I knew it wasn't. Even though I had 0 experience running from enforcers, I'd heard enough stories of people who had tried to evade them but had been found and captured. Our prospects weren't good. Chapter 19. "Should we wait until it gets dark or something?" Amy asked. "That would be ideal," Scott said. "But it won't be dark for another 5 hours, and we're too exposed here." I couldn't argue with that. Enforcers could come by at any moment. "How are we going to keep them from seeing us?" I asked, wondering how much experience Scott had in evading capture by enforcers. Of course, any amount was more than Amy and I had, but still, I fervently hoped he knew what he was doing. "I found a small shop around the corner that I think is run by friendlies." "What's a friendly?" Amy asked. "It means someone who believes in our cause, who's against the government control, someone who might help us." "Why do you think they're friendly?" I asked. I didn't want to get pulled into a place where we thought we would be safe, only to have the people turn on us. "I had a conversation with the man who's running the place. After a while, you get a feel for these things. I think he's okay." "I feel better if we knew for sure," I said. "I mean, what if he recognized me? Won't he be worried about helping us when the enforcers are so eager to get me? Wouldn't that put him on their bad list if they found out he was helping me?" I was hoping Scott would reassure me that people were willing to risk their own safety for others, but his hesitation only confirmed my concerns, and I again wondered if he knew what he was doing. "You're going to have to trust me, Morgan," he said with a frown. "I have to know you're going to do what I tell you without questioning me. Can you do that?" Could I? I had no idea if he could be trusted. I had to take care of me, and of course Amy. Did he care as much about us as we cared about ourselves? I had no way of knowing. All I knew was that I had no idea where Amy and I could hide. "Yes," I finally said. "Amy?" he asked. She looked at me as if to see if I meant it, then she nodded. "Yeah." "Good. Now wait here while I do a bit more recon." "Okay," we both said, and then he left. "Do you really trust him?" Amy asked. I looked at her, glad I wasn't completely alone. "I don't know. What about you?" Her lips pressed together as she shrugged. "Maybe we should stay with him for now." "That's what I was thinking," I said. Amy smiled, like she was glad she'd gotten the answer right. What she didn't know was that I was depending on her judgment. 5 minutes later, Scott returned. "Let's go." "Where?" I had to know I wasn't walking into a trap. Annoyance clouded his face. "You just said you would follow my instructions without asking questions." Looking away, he shook his head, then he met my eyes. "Do you want to stay here until dark, exposed? Or will you come with me?" Amy's hand slid into mine, and I knew she would do whatever I decided, which only made my decision more difficult. "Did you talk to the man in the shop?" I asked. Scott sighed. "Yes, he said he'd let us stay there until dark." "And he knows it's me who will be hiding there?" Scott hesitated. "I didn't tell him your name. I thought it best to keep it vague." When I imagined the shopkeeper's reaction to seeing me, shock, then immediately calling the enforcers, my heart began to stutter. "Your hood, Morgan," Amy said. "Put on your hood." "Exactly what I was about to suggest," Scott said as he glanced at Amy. "And you'll stay close to me as we enter the store. The man showed me where to go, so you won't have to talk to him." "Okay." Maybe this would work. I pulled up my hood, glad this jacket had one, and stood. Amy stood as well, then we followed Scott out from behind the dumpster. Though glad to leave the awful smell behind, I missed our hiding spot and pulled my hood close around my face as we approached the corner that would expose us to any passers-by. Amy pulled her hood up as well, and we stayed close to Scott as he rounded the corner. A row of shops with people streaming in and out filled my view. It was the middle of a Saturday, and it seemed everyone was out shopping. Staring at the ground as we walked, I avoided making eye contact with the people in my path. "Here we are," Scott murmured as we reached a store with clothing displayed in the windows. He opened the door and held it out for Amy and me, then he followed us inside. "This way." We walked right behind him as he wound his way through the clothing racks. There were only a few customers, but when I glanced at them out of the corner of my eye, they ignored us, focused on shopping. With my hood up, I felt conspicuous, but there was no way I would remove it as long as there were people who could see me. I wanted to look at the shopkeeper as I was certain he was watching us, but I didn't want him to know who Scott had brought in, so I forced myself to stare at the back of Scott's legs as he led us to somewhere that I hoped would be safe. A moment later, he pushed a door open and held it for us as we filed in. Once we were all inside, he closed and locked the door. A large storage room with racks of clothes surrounded us, and there was only one exit. I glanced at Scott. Did he have a plan in case the enforcers showed up? How would we get out without them catching us? Panic sliced through me, and it seemed as if the walls were coming closer to me, trapping me between them. "I don't like it here," I muttered. "Yeah," Amy said. "Neither do I." Scott sighed. "It's not my first choice, but I wanted to get you off the street." Sudden exhaustion swept over me, and I sank to the floor, leaning my back against the wall and squeezing my eyes closed. Movement beside me caught my attention, and I opened my eyes to see Amy beside me. "We're going to be okay, right?" she asked. I had no idea if we were, but I knew the truth wouldn't help. "Yeah," I said with a smile. "We are." The worry on her face evaporated, replaced by calm assurance. Guilt at my ineptitude gnawed at my insides. Everyone believed I had skills that I didn't, that I could survive anything, but it just wasn't true. What would Amy think? How would she feel if she knew the truth? We'd been sitting in the storage room for well over an hour when Amy announced her need to use the restroom. I said I needed to go too. "Let me scope it out," Scott said. Then he unlocked the storage room door and slipped out. A moment later, he returned. "There's one bathroom just around the corner and only a couple of customers in the store. Amy, you go first, then Morgan. Worried about my sister being out of my sight, I watched her leave, but she returned without incident a few minutes later. Your turn, she said with a smile. I nodded as I pulled up my hood. Then I left the storage room and entered the small bathroom. A few minutes later, I pulled the bathroom door open and found myself face to face with a man who seemed to be waiting for me. Our eyes met. His narrowed. Intense fear flared within me when I saw the spark of recognition in his face. So you're the one he's hiding in my store, the man said, as if he'd just discovered a great secret. Please don't call the enforcers, I whispered, as panic clawed its way up my throat. He stared at me, then he smiled. No, of course not. Thank you. I hurried back to the storage closet. The shopkeeper saw me, I said the moment I closed the door behind me. What? Scott asked. How? He was standing outside the bathroom when I came out. Great, he muttered. He said he wasn't going to call the enforcers, I added. That's reassuring, Scott said with a frown. We have to go, now. You don't think he meant it? I asked. There's a reward for you, Morgan. He probably thought I was hiding someone who didn't want to get taken to a fat center, not the most wanted person on the enforcer's list. Scott looked between Amy and me. Let's go. I tugged my jacket closer to me, almost feeling like that prevented people from seeing me, even though I knew that was dumb. Scott peered out the storage room door, then he motioned for us to follow him. The moment I stepped fully out of the closet, my gaze zoomed to the storekeeper, who looked at us in surprise. Where are you going? He asked. Thanks for letting us in, Scott replied. Are you leaving? The man pressed. Scott ignored him, obviously not interested in giving away our plans. You should stay, the man said. You'll be safer in here than out there. I glanced at Scott to see his reaction, but he just stared straight ahead and kept walking toward the rear exit. Was the man right? Would we be safer in here? Or had he called the enforcers and was just trying to get us to stay? Scott, I said through clenched teeth, panicked that no choice was the right one, but terrified to be out there. Wait. Keep moving, he said. Then he pushed the door open. We walked through the door and into the alley. What's wrong, Morgan? Amy asked from behind me. I'm just not sure if we should leave, I said loud enough for Scott to hear. Because you know so much about how the world works? Scott said, sarcasm thick in his voice. She's been through way more than you'll ever know, Amy said. I smiled at my sister, but a rush of guilt flooded my chest. Yeah, Scott said. I saw the video. Good, Amy said. Then you know you should listen to her. Oh, Amy, I thought. No, he shouldn't. I don't have a clue. Scott stopped and turned to face us. Let's get one thing straight right now. I'm the one calling the shots. I know where we're going and what we need to do to get there. Amy put her hands on her hips and glared at him. Then she looked at me, evidently waiting for me to argue. He's right, I said. We need to listen to him. Amy's angry stare faltered and her hands fell to her sides. I'll listen to you, Morgan. So if you say we should do what he says, I will. I released a sigh. Okay. Scott walked us back toward the dumpster. The stink assaulted my nose, and I wanted to hurry past the blue behemoth. Wait behind the dumpster while I check things out, Scott said. Not again, Amy muttered. I agreed with her, but I didn't argue. Instead, I tugged her with me to squat behind the stinking container. The air had become even colder, and I huddled into my jacket. 10 minutes later, Scott hadn't returned. How long should we wait? Amy asked. I was beginning to wonder the same thing. Maybe I should go see where he is, I said. Though scared of being seen, I knew we couldn't stay behind the dumpster indefinitely. I'll go with you, Amy immediately said. Glad I wouldn't be alone, I nodded. We stood and went in the direction we'd seen Scott go, our hoods pulled tightly against our heads. Using extreme caution, we walked to the end of the row of shops. Then I peered around the corner of the building, but quickly yanked my head back. What's wrong? Amy whispered. Terror threaded through me. They're here! The enforcers are here! Chapter 20. Let me see, Amy said. I traded places with her. She looked around the corner, then she gasped as she pulled back and stared at me, wide-eyed. "They have Scott!" "You saw him?" "Yes, he's handcuffed. They were putting him into one of their cars." "He was right," I said. "That shopkeeper must have called them." On the edge of full-blown panic, adrenaline surged through my body. "We have to get out of here, Amy." "Yes, but where should we go?" I had no idea. I just knew we needed to not be here. "Let's go that way." I pointed down the alley in the opposite direction of where we'd hidden. I didn't want to be anywhere near where we'd been. I took off at a run with Amy right beside me. We ran until the alley ended, then we continued running, passing a neighborhood and finding another alley behind a different shopping center. 2 miles from where the enforcers had apprehended Scott, I stopped, my lungs on fire. How did they know he was there? I panted, trying to make sense of this turn of events. Maybe he went back to see if the enforcers were coming and then they saw him. Her words came out in short gasps. But how did they know he was with us? Amy frowned. That shopkeeper probably told them what he looked like. We stood there for another minute, but certain the enforcers were searching for us. I was eager to get going. Now what? Amy looked at me with surprise, like she thought I should have all the answers. I don't know. You tell me. Telling her I wasn't Duplicate Morgan, that I had no clue what to do, wasn't an option, so I looked around and tried to come up with a plan. We stood behind a movie theater, which gave me an idea. Do you have any money, Amy? A little. I'll wait here while you buy 2 tickets to the movie that starts next, then come and get me. We'll hide in the dark theater until the movie's over. By then, it will be closer to sundown. Plus, it will give us time to think of what to do. Amy nodded, the worry evaporating from her face. I knew you would know what to do, Morgan. She smiled. I'll be right back. She took a step away, then she turned back to me. Are you sure you'll be okay out here by yourself? Forcing a confident smile onto my mouth, I nodded. You'll be back in a few minutes. I'm sure I'll be fine. Okay. She turned and walked away. I pressed myself against the wall, my hood tight against my face, terrified that the enforcers would appear at any moment and drag me to Holly. I've got 'em, Amy said 5 minutes later, startling me. She held a pair of tickets in her hand. Relieved beyond measure that I could get off the street, I grinned. You're awesome. She smiled back. I know, right? I put my arm around my sister and tugged her against me. I was thinking, she said. I don't want the ticket taker to recognize you, so you stay kind of behind me while I hand him the tickets, okay? Yes, right. I hadn't thought that far ahead, but it made sense. The chilly November air kept me from looking strange as I huddled into my jacket. Amy and I walked through the doors and into the theater lobby. Though keeping my hood on my head would look strange inside the building, I didn't remove it, deciding it was better to look odd than to take a chance on someone recognizing me. There's the guy who takes the tickets, Amy whispered. I nodded, but she wasn't looking at me. Instead, she was focused on her task. Hello, she said brightly as she handed the teenager our tickets. The boy barely glanced at her as he read the tickets. You're in theater too. He tore the tickets, then handed them back to Amy. His eyes went to the people in line behind us, and we walked past him without incident. Once inside the theater, we headed to the last row and sat on the aisle. Better to make a quick escape if the enforcers showed up. The idea sent a shiver of dread down my spine, but I tried not to think about that and instead considered what we should do next. By the time the movie started 10 minutes later, I still hadn't come up with any ideas. Settling into my padded seat, I half-watched the film while my mind wandered. Partway through the movie, when the characters on screen stopped to watch a news broadcast, I got an idea. Turning the possibilities over in my mind, I waited until the film ended before telling Amy my plan. It could work, she whispered. We stayed in the theater until the lights came up. Then, using extreme caution, we headed toward the lobby. No enforcers were in sight. It's getting really cold, Amy said as we stepped outside. Wondering where we would sleep that night, I nodded and said, I know. We walked to a bus stop, and keeping ourselves hidden in our jackets, we took the bus to the neighboring city where the news channel had their studios. "Do you think they'll let us in?" Amy asked as we approached the building where the news channel we'd chosen was headquartered. It was a large independent television station, so I was certain the government wasn't controlling it. "I hope so," I said. "Maybe we should call someone first, to let them know you're coming." I shook my head. I don't want to give them a chance to call the enforcers before we even get there. Even as I spoke with surety, I worried that my idea would fail before I'd had a chance to make it work. "Okay," Amy said. "That makes sense." I smiled at my sister, her complete faith in me boosting my flagging self-assurance. We entered the building's lobby and walked straight to the directory, which was posted near the elevators. "4th floor," I murmured after I'd quickly perused the list of businesses in the building. We got in the elevator, but when I pressed the button for the 4th floor, nothing happened. I pressed it again and again, but the elevator never moved. "Do you think you have to have a pass or something?" I asked. "Maybe," Amy said. "What are you going to do?" "I think we're going to have to call them so that someone will let us go up." "I saw a phone on the wall by the directory," Amy said. A moment later, I held the phone in my hand and waited while it rang on the other end. "News 5, a female voice answered in a semi-bored voice. "Hi," I said. "I'm in the lobby and I need to come up to your floor to talk to someone." "Who do you want to talk to?" I couldn't remember the name of any of the news anchors. "One of your reporters." The woman sighed. "What is this about?" Knowing in my gut that I shouldn't reveal my identity, I hesitated, but saying something about Morgan Campbell would surely get their attention. "I have some information about what happened today with a Morgan Campbell interview." The woman was silent for several seconds. "Okay." She dragged the word out like she was interested but skeptical. "I'll send someone to escort you up." "Thank you." I hung up the phone and turned to Amy with a grin. "We're in." Chapter 21. We waited 5 minutes before the elevator slid open, and a girl who looked like she was in her early 20s stepped out. "Are you the ones who called?" she asked us. "Yes." I wondered how long it would take her to recognize me, fearful about what she would do when she did. "I'm Cammy." She smiled and held out her hand. "Hi." I shook her hand but didn't give my name. Her eyes narrowed as she studied me, then she gestured to the elevator. "Right this way." Had she recognized me? Would she report me the moment she had access to a phone? Apprehension churned in my gut, and I wanted to turn and run, but the elevator door slid closed, and Cammy waved her card in front of a reader before pressing the button for the 4th floor. "What did you say your name is?" she asked as she stared right at me. I said the first name that came to mind, and even kept my voice steady as I spoke. "It's Holly." I glanced at Amy. "That's Rochelle." "Hi," Amy said with a smile. "Hey," Cammy replied, barely looking at Amy before focusing back on me. Terrified about what this girl was thinking, I felt my stomach roil. The elevator doors slid open. "Here we are," Cammy said. Then she stepped out and turned to me and Amy. When I hesitated, Amy put her hand against my back and gently nudged me forward. I left the relative safety of the elevator, and when Cammy turned and walked toward a glass door with her station's logo painted on it, Amy and I followed. "Wait here," Cammy said, once we reached the reception area. She smiled brightly. "I'll be right back." The moment she was out of earshot, I turned to Amy. "Do you think she recognized me? Do you think she'll call the enforcers?" Amy's forehead creased. "I don't know." Anxiety squeezed my chest. "Maybe we should leave." "Hello," a woman said as she crossed the reception area and headed toward us. I immediately recognized her from the news broadcasts I'd seen my parents watch. "Hi." She held out her hand. "I'm Jessica Walker." She wore a tailored business suit, and her blonde hair brushed against her shoulders. I shook her hand. "I'm Holly, and this is Rochelle." "I understand you have some information about the Morgan Campbell incident." "Yes." She looked at me expectantly. "Can we talk somewhere private?" I asked. She smiled warmly. "Certainly." We followed her to a room that held a table surrounded by half a dozen chairs. "Have a seat, Holly." Amy and I sat across from her. "What did you want to tell me?" she asked. I appraised her. "Do you really not recognize me?" I had to know. Jessica's smile never wavered. "Of course I recognize you, Morgan. Your picture's been all over the news today." She laughed. "I myself have spent quite a bit of time reporting on the enforcer's search for you today." Alarm rippled through me. She knew it was me. Cammy must know too. Had she called the enforcers? Was this woman stalling me until they got there? I jumped out of my chair. "It was a mistake coming here." Jessica stood as well. "Please sit, Morgan. You're safe here." "What about Cammy? I think she recognized me too." "Yes, she told me that you were in reception." I stayed on my feet. "Did she call the enforcers?" Jessica shook her head. "No, I promise you that she didn't. No one has." She paused. "Look, Morgan, you came to us." "Like I said, I made a mistake." "Please, give me a chance." She smiled softly. "Being the first reporter to talk to you directly is quite a scoop. I wouldn't ruin that by calling the enforcers." For some reason, I believed her. Besides, I had nowhere else to turn. Slowly, I sank back into my chair. She sat as well. "Now, why did you come here?" Heart slamming against my ribs, I gazed at her, then took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. "You know about the news conference today and how it ended so suddenly," I began. She half smiled. "Yes, today is usually my day off, but I came in just so I could report on your news conference. I was a bit disappointed when I didn't get to ask a single question." Her smile grew. "I suppose I'm making up for it now." It kind of amazed me that my appearance at a news conference would make someone give up their day off, and that me showing up now would make this woman so excited. "Before we go any farther, Morgan, would you mind if I had my cameraman come in here to film our conversation?" I hesitated. "I promise he's trustworthy." That was one of my concerns, but the other was timing. "When will you show our interview?" "As soon as possible, of course." "Of course." "You have to give Amy and me time to leave first, like at least an hour." "I understand." I didn't know if I could trust her to keep her word, but again, I didn't know what other choice I had. "Thank you." "Wait here while I get my cameraman." When she closed the door behind her, I turned to Amy. "So far so good, I guess." "Yeah," she said. "Do you think it will work, though? Do you think it will make a difference if people hear your side of the story?" "I hope so," I said. "I mean, if the news people are talking about how the enforcers are hunting for me, then maybe getting my side of the story will persuade people to pressure the enforcers to back off." "What if it doesn't work?" Amy asked. My heart plummeted at the thought. "It has to work, Amy. It just has to." The door swung open, and I jerked my head around so that I could see what was happening. "This is Mac," Jessica said. "He's going to film our conversation." I met the eyes of the man who stared at me. He looked away, then carried his equipment to the other side of the room. Before long, he had everything set up, with a camera pointed in our direction. "All set, Jess," he said. "Thanks." She turned back to me. "Morgan, tell me what happened this afternoon. You were in the middle of a news conference when you were abruptly cut off. What happened after that?" I told her how the enforcers had found our location and how we'd raced out of the building. Genuine concern filled her face. "What are you going to do now?" I shrugged, and as the reality of our predicament crashed over me, tears filled my eyes. "I don't know." Now was the time to make my plea to everyone who would eventually see this interview. I didn't try to hold back the tears as they spilled over my lashes and ran down my cheeks. "I haven't done anything wrong, and now my life is in danger." I paused. "I'm only 16. The seriousness of my situation overwhelmed me. Amy and I were alone. I had no idea what to do. The enforcers would be thrilled to get their hands on me and take me to Holly the torturer. A sob rose from my throat, and I didn't try to stop it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Jessica's eyes shimmered, and I could tell my words had touched her. I was glad I was having that effect on her, because that meant I would probably have the same effect on the people who would later watch the interview. "One day I was going to high school like every other teenager," I said, "and the next, I was locked up in a fat center getting tortured by grown-ups who I thought were supposed to help me." My tears flowed faster, and the emotions I felt were genuine. Even though I wasn't the one who'd been tortured, I was terrified that inevitably I would be. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Morgan," Jessica said as she rested her hand on my arm. "I've seen the video from when you were in Camp Stonewater. I want you to know that I think it's disgusting what they did to you." My tears slowed and I nodded. "Thank you." "If you can," she continued, "would you tell me how you felt when you realized that the people who had you under their control were only interested in gathering information from you? That they had no problem torturing you, a teenaged girl, to get what they wanted?" Putting myself in Duplicate Morgan's place, I described how betrayed and hopeless I'd felt. "I know the enforcers were mad at me for pretending to be someone else," I added at the end, "but I don't understand how they could do that to anyone, especially to a teenager. It just seems so barbaric." "The enforcers are saying that you and your friend Billy may be responsible for the death of Enforcer Hansen," Jessica said. "What do you have to say about that?" I shook my head. "I don't know anything about that, I swear. All I want is to go back to my life and be with my family." "What about Billy Foster? Where is he?" In some other world, I thought, where it's supposedly legal to be overweight. But instead I said, "I don't know. I haven't seen him in like a week." That was completely true. Jessica asked me more questions about my time in Camp Willamette and Camp Stonewater, and I answered her questions the best that I could. 2 hours later, she stopped asking questions, then offered us something to eat. We gratefully accepted, and after we'd eaten, I asked, "Are we done?" She smiled. "Yes, thank you so much for talking to me." "Thank you for not calling the enforcers," I said. "I'd like to talk to you again," she said, "and I know you wouldn't be willing to talk to me if you couldn't trust me." She paused. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" "No, not yet." She smiled. "Wait here." "Okay." When Amy and I were alone, I said, "I'm glad we came here." "You did great," she said. "Thanks." Her praise meant a lot to me, because if she believed I was DM, everyone else would too. After a few minutes, Jessica returned with Cammy right behind her. "Cammy's agreed to take you somewhere safe," Jessica said. Agreed, I thought. Did that mean it wasn't her idea? How did she actually feel about it? Because she could get in a lot of trouble for harboring Amy and me when the enforcers were searching for us. My eyes met hers and she smiled. She seemed sincere, but it was hard to believe she was really willing to put herself on the line for two people she just met. "Are you guys ready to go?" she asked. Chapter 22. I was more than ready, but I was also hesitant. I had to protect not only myself, but Amy. I didn't want to lead us into a trap. There was a reward for our capture. Did Cammy know that? I frowned. She worked in a newsroom. Of course she knew. Amy and I followed Cammy out of the room where we'd been for the last 2 hours. "We'll take the elevator down to the parking garage," Cammy said as she pressed the button to call the elevator. The three of us stepped into the elevator, and Cammy pressed the P for parking. "Jess said she was really happy with the way your interview went." Cammy smiled. "I can't wait to see it." She seemed sincere, but I couldn't help but worry about what, or who, would be waiting for us once the doors to the elevator opened. We reached the parking garage, and to my relief, no one was there. "My car's over there," Cammy said, gesturing to a nearby stall. Without a word, we followed her to a dark green car where she used her key fob to remotely unlock the doors. "Climb in." I got in the passenger seat while Amy got in behind me. Once Cammy slid into the driver's seat, I turned to face her. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Why are you helping us?" She frowned at me. "I saw what they did to you, Morgan. It's not right." But you could get in a lot of trouble. I exhaled a breath of air. A lot of trouble. Her lips pressed into a straight line, and she glanced at her lap before meeting my eyes. I'd rather not think about that if you wouldn't mind. I didn't want to think about the horrible things that were waiting for me either, but over the last week, I'd come to accept that this nightmare I'd been thrust into was completely out of my control. Yeah, I said, okay. She smiled, turned on the engine, then backed out of her parking space. When we pulled into the street, I saw that it was full dark. Somehow, that made me feel safer. You don't talk much, Cammy said to Amy as she looked at her in the rearview mirror. I turned in my seat to see Amy's face. She glanced at me, then smiled at Cammy. Morgan's the one with a story that everyone wants to hear. But you were there too, Cammy said, in Camp Willowmoss. Yes, Amy said, and it was awful, but at least I wasn't tortured. Her gaze went to her lap. Not really. What do you mean? Cammy asked, obviously trying to see if there was another story here. Amy met her eyes in the mirror. I was bullied and picked on, but no one ever put something into my neck that made me writhe on the floor in agony. Guilt clogged my throat. Here I was, getting all the attention from the media for what DM had endured, but between Amy and me, she was the one who'd actually suffered. I turned back to stare at the road, fearful that Amy would read the lie in my eyes. 15 minutes later, Cammy pulled up to an apartment building. On the lookout for enforcers, I glanced around the dimly lit parking area. Is this where you live? She pulled into a parking space marked for guests, then she turned to me. No, my boyfriend lives here. Your boyfriend? I can't very well take you to my place, she said. Once the enforcers see your interview with Jessica, they'll question all of us about where you went. Fear clouded her eyes. They might even search our homes. She laughed, but it was the laughter of the terrified. You can't be there. But you think your boyfriend would be okay hiding us? I asked. Even I could hear the skepticism in my voice. I don't know, okay? I'll have to ask him. I stared at her. Was it your idea to bring us somewhere safe, or did Jessica tell you to? She stared at her lap before meeting my eyes. I owed her a favor, a big one, so yeah, she asked me to, and I agreed. Now that made sense. No one was crazy enough to willingly offer to harbor the enforcer's most wanted fugitive. I stared at her. And now you regret it. I'm sorry, she said, but you have to understand. I can't get taken to one of those places. Her lips compressed. I'm not strong like you. I can't do what you did. Then you need to speak out, Amy said from the back seat. If you feel that way, then lots of other people must feel that way too. Amy sighed. Don't you see? If most of the people agree that the fat centers are bad, then we can change things. Cammy turned in her seat and met Amy's stare. I know, but I'm scared, you know? We all are, I said. Cammy was quiet. I need to talk to my boyfriend. Wait here, okay? We nodded, then she got out of the car and disappeared into the darkness. Do you think he'll let us stay here? Amy asked. Freezing air seeped into the car and I shivered. I hope so. If not, this would be a long night. What's taking her so long? Amy asked when Cammy had been gone for at least 15 minutes. The long wait was getting to me too. Maybe we should just go, I said. But where? It's freezing out there, Morgan. The inside of the car was getting pretty cold too, but Amy was right. Outside was even worse. Cammy appeared out of the darkness, opened the driver's side door, and climbed inside. A gust of cold air followed her in, and I shivered. When I looked at her face, I immediately knew she didn't have good news. What did he say? She bit her lip, then she reached into the pocket of her slacks and pulled something out. I'm so sorry, she began, but he said no. She held out a wad of cash. Here's some money. Maybe that will help? Hopelessness, uncertainty, and terror nearly swamped me, and as I stared at the bills in Cammy's hand, my hand refused to reach out to take them. I lifted my eyes to hers. What are we supposed to do? Shaking her head, she set the money in my lap. I don't know, Morgan. She bit her lip again and averted her gaze. "I'm really sorry, but he's just not willing to take the risk." And neither are you, I thought. But I couldn't blame her. To be honest, I didn't know if I would have been willing to take the risk for a stranger. "So," Amy said, leaning forward so that she was nearly between Cammy and me, "you're just going to send us out there by ourselves? How can you do that? We're just kids." Cammy's brows pulled inward as she stared at her lap. Then she met Amy's accusing stare. "I'm sorry for what's happening to you, but there's nothing I can do to help you." She gestured to the pile of money in my lap. "That's all I can do right now, okay?" "No," Amy said, her voice growing louder. "No, it's not okay. You're just like everyone else, a coward." She glared at Cammy, then she opened the door nearest her and climbed out, slamming it behind her. It was done. There was no changing Cammy's mind. I knew that, and Amy obviously knew that too. Gathering the money into my hands, I straightened the pile into a neat stack, pausing in the hopes that Cammy's guilty conscience would force her to invite us to her place, but she was silent. I tucked the cash into my pocket and looked at her. "Good luck," she murmured without meeting my eyes. I stared out the window and saw Amy standing on the sidewalk, her hands jammed into her coat pockets. At least we have each other, I thought. I pulled my door open and stepped onto the asphalt of the parking lot, then softly closed the door. The engine turned on and I walked over to Amy. Cammy backed out of her space and drove off. I stood next to Amy and stared at Cammy's fading taillights. "This sucks," Amy said. "A few hours ago we had less than we have now," I said, trying to cheer myself up as much as her. She laughed. "Yeah, I guess you're right." She looked around. "Maybe we can go to a motel or something." "I think you have to be at least 18 to rent a room," I said. Even if I was old enough, I wouldn't want to show my ID to anyone, not that I even had an ID. "Oh," Amy said, as she rubbed her arms through her jacket. "Where should we go then?" I shrugged. "Let's just start walking. At least that will warm us up." Cars occasionally drove past us as we walked along the sidewalk, which didn't surprise me since it was Saturday evening. But at least no one paid attention to us. 10 minutes later, I sensed someone following us. Alarmed, I whispered to Amy, "I think someone's behind us." "Maybe it's just someone who's out walking too," she whispered back. As much as I wanted to believe that, things hadn't exactly gone our way that day, so I imagined the worst. Not only that, but I had no idea where we were. We could be in the worst part of town, the part where gangs would attack you just for being there. My thoughts began to spiral out of control, and I had an overwhelming urge to run. I grabbed Amy's hand and yanked her forward. "Come on!" I whisper-screamed. We dashed forward, and over the pounding of our feet, I heard another set of feet charging up behind us. Hysteria climbed my throat. "He's going to catch us!" "Wait!" a male voice called out. We picked up speed. "Stop!" he said, his voice getting closer. We ignored him. "Morgan!" he called out. "I want to help you!" That got my attention, but also spurred me to run faster. For all I knew, his help involved the enforcers. "Cammy is my brother's girlfriend," he called out, his breathing ragged. That was unexpected, and I slowed my pace. But as I considered the possibility that he was lying, I didn't stop. But why would he lie about that? And how would this stranger even know anything about Cammy bringing Amy and me here? "I want to help you," he said again as he drew alongside us. "Stop, Morgan," Amy said. "We've got to stop." Amy's command cut through the confusion in my brain. I stopped and faced this unknown person. The three of us stood on the sidewalk at the edge of a darkened park, but the darkness didn't scare me. The darkness was a blanket that wrapped around me and hid me from the cars that drove by, their headlights casting a spotlight over us. I looked the boy over, assessing his level of danger. He wore a hoodie, and he had the hood pulled up onto his head. I guessed he was close to my age, maybe a little older. From what I could see of his hair, it was dark and brushed the tops of his ears. I couldn't tell the color of his eyes in the dim light, but when he turned his head to look at the cars driving by, part of a tattoo peeked out of his collar on the right side of his neck. He may or may not have been a dangerous person, but as far as being a danger to me, he didn't seem the type to interact with enforcers on purpose. "Let's go over there," I said, pointing to a bench hidden in the shadows. "Fine," the boy said. Chapter 23. The three of us faded into the darkness of the park and headed toward the bench. Amy and I sat on the metal slats while the boy stayed standing. Having a hard time believing anyone would voluntarily help us, I asked, "What do you want?" He sighed, then squatted in front of me. "Like I said, my brother is Cammie's boyfriend. I heard them arguing about you, and when my brother refused to help you, I knew it was up to me." Did he know about the money Cammie had given me? Was it actually his brother's money? Did this boy want it for himself? "Why would you want to help us?" "You don't trust me. I get that." One side of his mouth quirked up. "You're smart not to trust anyone." For some reason, his praise pleased me. Maybe it was because I'd been feeling like such a failure, or maybe I was just desperate for any scrap of approval that I was doing at least one thing right. Whatever the reason, I found myself smiling. "Thank you." "But you can trust me," he said softly as he leaned closer, and even in the shadowy light, I could see he was really cute. "Why should we trust you?" Amy said, freezing any warmth that had begun to develop between this boy and me. He shifted his attention to her. "Because I haven't called the enforcers." "Yet," she spat out. His lip curled into a sneer. "I wouldn't call those jerks if my life depended on it." "Really?" I asked. "Why not?" The boy stood, then sat to my right, putting me between him and Amy. "Are you telling me you would?" I made a scoffing sound. "Not likely." His sneer turned to a smile. "There you go." "Oh," Amy said, "so just like that we should trust you, because you claim you would never call the enforcers?" She jumped up from the bench. "Okay then, I guess we'll tell you everything now." "Stop it, Amy," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended. It wasn't every day that a stranger offered to help us, and I didn't want to scare him away. She stared at me, her eyebrows pulling together. "Can I talk to you, Morgan? Alone?" My gaze shot to the boy beside me, then back to Amy. "Okay." "I'll just be over there," he said as he stood. We watched him walk a short distance away, then Amy sat beside me. "Who is this kid?" Her eyes narrowed. "And why did it seem like you were defending him? Do you trust him?" I shook my head slightly. "I don't know yet, okay? But we have to trust someone." I sighed. "I don't know what else to do." She tilted her head. "What do you mean you don't know what else to do? You hid from the enforcers before. What did you do then? Why don't we do that?" I so wished I could tell her the truth, but there was no way she would believe me. I hardly believed it. "Look, Amy, this time is different." That much was true. In many ways. Not only had I never been in a fat center, I'd never escaped from one or hidden from enforcers. But more than that, this time they thought I'd murdered one of their own. They had to be laser focused on capturing me. A shudder burst over me at the thought. I couldn't begin to consider the possibility that they were right and that DM had actually killed Enforcer Hansen. I had to believe she had nothing to do with it. "What do you mean?" Amy asked. "We're on our own this time," I said. I glanced in the direction the boy had gone and saw him leaning against a tree, his back to us as he stared at the road. "Amy, we can use any help we can get." Amy stared at me. "Do you think we can trust him?" I thought about it. "Yeah, I think we can." A small smile curved her mouth. "Okay, if you do, then I will." Amy looked at the boy. "Hey you," she called out. He turned in our direction. "Come back here." "You've gotten really bossy, little sister," I murmured. Amy grinned. The boy stood in front of us. "What?" "We decided we would let you help us," Amy said. He laughed. "Maybe I don't want to anymore. You two aren't exactly friendly to those who offer their help." Crossing my arms over my chest, I frowned. Maybe that's because we've been screwed over too many times. My frown deepened. I thought about Nick using me as a distraction earlier that day, and how the reporter, Jessica Walker, had been more than happy to get this scoop interview with me. Yeah, I'd been using her too, but still. Everyone seems to have their own reasons for helping us, I said. What's yours? Maybe I want to get back at the enforcers. Maybe I think they deserve whatever misery comes their way. His voice hardened as he spoke. Maybe I want them to suffer like I've suffered. That was good enough for me. All right. Well, if we're going to spend time together, maybe you should tell us your name. You already know ours. The anger he'd shown moments before seeped away, and he smiled. My friends call me Falcon. Amy's nose crinkled. Like the bird? He laughed. Just like the bird. Falcon, I said, trying out the unusual name. Why do they call you that? Amy asked. Do you know anything about falcons? He asked her. No. Do you? He asked me. I shook my head. Falcons are birds of prey, ladies. Amy said. I don't get it. Falcon rolled his eyes. I'm like a bird of prey. I attack my enemies when they least expect it. He grinned. You see? I held back a laugh. I wasn't sure if he was dangerous or ridiculous. What I did know was that I felt comfortable around him, and I was starting to like him more and more. Here, he said, as he tugged the right shoulder of his hoodie downward so that more of his tattoo showed. Check this out. Amy and I peered at the ink on his body. What is it? Amy asked. A falcon, of course. Oh, she said. He pulled the hoodie back into place. We should have nicknames too, Morgan, Amy said. This time I couldn't hold back a laugh. Oh yeah? Like what? She pressed a finger to her cheek. Let's stick with the bird theme. I remember learning at school that crows and ravens are pretty smart. Which would you rather be? I glanced at Falcon. I like the name Raven better. Amy smiled. Okay then, you're Raven. What about you? I asked her. I think I should be Hummingbird. You know, small and fast. I laughed. I like it. Raven and Hummingbird, Falcon said with a grin. You girls are crazy. No crazier than you, Amy said. You're the one offering to help us. Afraid Amy would scare him off, I jumped in. Do you have any idea where we can go? I'm kind of freezing. Yeah, he said. While I was waiting for you to decide if you'd let me help you, he stared meaningfully at Amy, who rolled her eyes. I thought of a place we could go. Great, I thought. Where is this place? Not far. Is it safe? That's what mattered most. Yeah, I think so. You think so? Amy asked. Falcon glared at her. Maybe you should stay here, little Hummingbird, and I'll just take Raven. Though flattered that he was willing to risk his safety for me, I couldn't let him talk to Amy that way, not after all she'd done for me. I put my arm around her shoulder and faced him. Where I go, she goes. Always. He smiled. That's cool. Then his smile faded. But I don't appreciate the attitude. You have to understand, I said. We have to look out for ourselves. If we don't, who will? Yeah, I get that. Good, Amy said. Then you understand why I have an attitude. She did air quotes on that. He shook his head. Whatever. He glanced at me. So, are you going to come with me or not? Once again, I didn't see that I had any other options, unless we wanted to sleep in the park and freeze. Yeah, I said, let's go. About time, he muttered. Then he turned and walked away, with Amy and me hurrying to follow. Chapter 24. 20 minutes later, we were still trudging along, which only gave me more time to worry about where this boy named Falcon was taking us. Was his show of hatred toward the enforcers an act? Was he leading us into a trap? Had I let his friendliness distract me from my core goal, to keep Amy and myself safe? Here we are, he announced, stopping in front of a 3-story building that looked abandoned. What is this place? Amy asked, doubt evident in her voice. This place, little Hummingbird, is where you will be safe and less cold. Less cold wasn't warm, but it was better than freezing. Quit calling me that, Amy spat out. Falcon laughed. You're the one who came up with the name. I never said little. I'm not little. I could almost hear her adding, you jerk. I came up with Hummingbird because they're small and fast, like me. Little, small, he frowned. What's the difference? The difference is that little implies young and inexperienced. Of which I'm neither. I'm just not as tall as some girls. When Falcon sighed, clearly exasperated, I wondered how much experience he had with younger sisters. Not much, I guessed. I held back a laugh. Amy had become quite formidable. I was glad she was on my side. Okay, Hummingbird, do you want to go inside where it's less cold? Amy smirked. Less cold is good. Yes, I added. I'd also love to get off the street. Every time a car passed, I wanted to melt into the sidewalk. Okay then, follow me. Falcon walked to the doorway, pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, then flicked it on. The space in front of the doorway illuminated, then Falcon opened the door. Why was that unlocked? Amy asked, her voice showing her suspicion that this was all a setup. What? Falcon asked as he held it open for us. The door, she said. Shouldn't it be locked? He laughed. That just means one of my friends is here. Whoever gets here first picks the lock, then leaves it unlocked for the other two. Wait a minute, I said, alarmed. Who else is here? I don't know yet. We'll have to go see. I took a step back. Falcon obviously understood my reluctance. Don't worry, they're all cool. Who? Amy asked. Who's cool? Who's in there? Maybe we should go somewhere else, I said. I don't have anywhere else to take you. He sighed. Tell you what, come into the foyer, then wait there while I check it out, okay? Not thrilled, but exhausted and cold, I nodded. Just don't tell them my name. Duh, Raven. Liking my new name, especially when it came from Falcon's mouth, I smiled. He shook his head, then he vaulted up the stairs and disappeared. He's kind of a jerk, Amy said. Don't you think? I tried to hide my smile. I guess. Amy tilted her head and sighed. Great, you like him. Is that so terrible? I asked. She rolled her eyes. A few minutes later, Falcon returned. Both of my buddies are up there. I told them I was bringing some new people up, and they're cool with that. They might have been cool with that, but I wasn't so sure. Maybe we can wait until they leave or something, I said. I wasn't eager to be back on the street, but facing a new pair of strangers was just as scary. Falcon's mouth quirked into a half smile. They're not going anywhere. Why? Amy asked. Do they live here or something? No, but they just got here, so they won't be leaving for a long time. What do you guys do here anyway? I asked. Just hang out. Mostly get away from home for a while. He paused, like he was waiting for more questions, but I didn't know what else to ask. Look, Raven, I've known these guys my whole life. You can trust them. I didn't even know if I could trust Falcon. Why would I trust his friends? Okay, I heard myself saying. Really? Amy asked. You're okay with this? I wasn't okay with anything that had happened in the last week, but I was too wrung out to argue. If Falcon's friends wanted to call the enforcers, I would deal with it then. I had to trust someone. I looked at Amy and shrugged. She sighed and shook her head. Okay, Falcon said as he turned the lock on the door behind us. Right this way, ladies. I tugged my hood close to my face, then followed him up 2 flights of stairs and into a room that looked like it had once been an office, a fairly large office. 2 boys sat near a propane-powered space heater, but when we entered the room, they stared at us. This is Raven and Hummingbird, Falcon said, gesturing to the 2 of us. Then he pointed to the boys. That's Connor and Austin. Do you have your own flock now? Connor asked. Austin laughed, and I looked at Falcon to see his reaction, but it was too dim in the room to clearly make out his face. Very funny, Connor, he said. Why don't you move over so these ladies can get warmed up by the heater? Yeah, sure, Falk. The boys moved out of the way, and Amy and I eagerly sat beside the space heater, trying to absorb as much warmth as we could. Remembering hearing something about carbon monoxide poisoning, I asked, Is it safe to run a propane heater indoors? That one's meant for indoors, Falcon said. Then he pointed to a window which was open a few inches. Plus, we ventilate. It's safe. I nodded and allowed myself to enjoy the warmth. Where do you girls go to school? Austin asked. The last school I'd attended was Fox Run High, but DM had last gone to the high school in Timber Hills. I decided to go with a place I knew. Besides, I didn't want to give any clue that I was Morgan Campbell. Foxhorn High School, I finally said. What about you? He rattled off the name of a high school I'd never heard of, then asked, What brings you to our humble abode on this fine evening? Just, I want to get away from my parents for a while. That was so opposite of the truth that it made my chest ache, but that was the answer I figured he wanted to hear. Yeah, I know what you mean. He used his chin to gesture toward Falcon. Right, Falk? Yeah, Falcon said, his voice sounding downcast. Whatever. Curious what his story was, I tucked away the question to dig into at a later time. What about you, Hummingbird? Austin asked. You seem a little young to be in a place like this on a Saturday night. He laughed. Or any night. What's wrong with this place? Amy asked. Is it full of rats or something? She gave Falcon a sidelong glance when she said it, making it clear she thought he was one of the aforementioned rats. I don't think she likes you, Falk, Connor said. Maybe you need to look for more birds to add to your flock. You're a laugh riot, Connor, Falcon said. They continued to banter, but I barely listened to them as the warmth of the space heater made me drowsy. My head dipped toward my chest and I jerked awake, terrified that if I fell asleep I would wake up in Holly the torturer's custody. Despite my resolve to stay awake all night, my body refused to cooperate, and the next thing I knew, someone was shaking me and calling for Raven. It took me a moment to remember that I was Raven, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Falcon leaning over me, a grin on his face. Chapter 25. That's when I noticed how light the room was. It's morning, he said. Morning? I slept all night? I jerked upright, my eyes seeking out Amy, who was curled up beside me. Yes. Where are your friends? It was just the three of us in the room, and I feared Connor and/or Austin may have called the enforcers. They left last night. Oh, maybe they hadn't called the enforcers, because if they had, surely the enforcers would have come to get me immediately. Did they recognize me? He shook his head. I made them leave you alone, so they never got close enough to get a good look. Relieved beyond measure, I smiled. Thank you. How'd you sleep? Now that he brought it up, I realized my body ached from sleeping on the hard floor. Okay. I squinted at him. Did you sleep? Nah, I kept watch. You did? His admission surprised me. Did he really care about what happened to Amy and me? Or did he have another reason to keep watch? Are the enforcers after you too? He burst out laughing, but I had no idea why my question was so hilarious. I'll take that as a no, I murmured. He got himself under control. Sorry, it's just that... He shook his head. Never mind, it's not important. More curious than ever about Falcon, I stared at him. Won't your family wonder where you were all night? This seemed to sober him. No. Do you live with your brother? For now. For now? He huffed out a breath. Yes, for now. Okay. Clearly, he didn't want to talk about it. Are you hungry? He asked. Yes. Good, I'll get us some food. He jumped up and headed toward the doorway. Torn between not wanting him to leave us here alone, yet afraid to leave the relative safety of this place, I called out, Wait! He stopped, then turned and looked at me. I had no idea how to express my fear without sounding nothing like DM would sound. I was certain she would be brave and fearless. In fact, she would probably be the one heading out to get food, not sending some boy she'd barely met. Then again, she wouldn't have had to. Billy would have been with her. Falcon stared at me, then he came to my side and squatted beside me. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Don't worry, Raven. I'll take care of you. This was the first time I'd seen him in such bright light and so close up, and when my eyes met his, I was captivated by the color of his irises. Crystal blue, but rimmed by sapphire, they reminded me of the sparkling waters in some tropical paradise. That, coupled with his reassuring words, made a feeling of security sweep over me. Thank you, I whispered. I'll be back as soon as I can. He stood. I nodded, then watched him leave. A moment later, I heard the front door close behind him. Worried someone else would walk right in, I ran down the stairs and locked the door, then rushed back up the stairs and went to the window. I could just see Falcon turning the corner at the end of the street. I looked at Amy and was tempted to curl up and go to sleep myself, but when I thought of all that had happened the day before, I found myself on alert and wide awake. I couldn't chance being caught unaware, so I sat on the windowsill and gazed out onto the street, on the lookout for anyone who didn't belong, but particularly for enforcers. "What's going on?" Amy asked when she woke up a while later. "Hey." I sat on the floor beside her. "Falcon went to get us some food." She pushed herself up. "He's still around?" I laughed. "Yes. Does that surprise you?" "Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, why would he want to stay with us?" Her question made me doubt Falcon all over again. Why would he want to stay with us? What was in it for him? "I don't know, Amy." She smirked. "It's Hummingbird, remember?" I laughed. "Sorry." I glanced at the window. "I'd better get back to my post. I don't want anyone to sneak up on us." "Good idea." I went back to the windowsill and got comfortable. Not many people had passed by. Then again, it was early on a Sunday morning. Then I saw Falcon come around the corner. I hustled down to the door and unlocked it, and a moment later he pulled it open. "Oh, hey," he said, seemingly startled to find me standing there. "I locked the door after you left, so when I saw you coming—" He held up a bag. "I got you some breakfast." "Great." "Is Hummingbird awake?" "Yeah." After spreading the food out on the floor of our new home, we all dug in. "While I was out," Falcon said, around a mouthful of food, "I got a little information." "What did you find out?" Amy asked. "Did they show Raven's interview with that reporter?" "Yeah, I stopped by a diner that had the morning news on, and they were talking about it, even showing some clips from it." "So what information did you get?" I asked, anxious to know something about my possible fate. "A man representing the enforcers was on the show I saw. He said they have evidence that you—" Falcon cleared his throat. "That you, murdered Enforcer Hansen." Oh no, I thought. She did it. DM actually did it. What kind of evidence? Maybe they were lying, just trying to get people riled up about me. "They said they found DNA evidence at the scene of his murder. DNA that belongs to you." He seemed to hesitate. "What?" "They also found DNA evidence that someone named Billy Foster was there. He's wanted too." Falcon's eyes narrowed. "Who's Billy Foster?" A boy I knew for about 15 minutes, I thought. "Someone I met at Campbell." I shook my head as fresh fury at DM bloomed within me. She'd murdered an enforcer, then fled this world. Nice. "I don't know where Billy is," I said, which was sort of true. "Well, you're in deep trouble, Raven." Clearly, I thought. "It's not true though, right?" Amy asked me. "You didn't kill him, right?" "Me?" I vigorously shook my head. "No, I didn't kill him." They could take a polygraph of that, and I would pass it. Of course, that would bring up a whole different crop of problems. Amy's eyebrows pulled in. "Did Billy?" I had no idea. "I don't know anything about Enforcer Hansen's murder, okay? Can we drop it now?" "Sorry," she mumbled. "It's not your fault, Amy." This was so messed up. I turned to Falcon. "Do you know if my interview had any impact at all on people?" Self-pity and despair mingled within me, and when I spoke again, it sounded like a plea. Like, "Does anyone want to help me?" "I do," Falcon said. "I want to help you." His sincerity touched me, and I nodded with a smile. When I met his gaze, I was again struck by the intense blue of his eyes. "Thank you." "But what about other people?" Amy asked. "Does anyone else believe her? Does anyone else want to change things? Is anyone else as brave as us?" Falcon turned to her, his lips compressed. "I don't have the answer to that, Hummingbird." So, the interview might not have helped at all, but at least it had brought me to Falcon, the only person in the world who wanted to help me. Chapter 26. "Who owns this building anyway?" I asked. We'd finished cleaning up from breakfast, and the three of us sat in a circle near the space heater. "I don't know," Falcon said. "I just know it's been vacant for the last few months." He chuckled. "This isn't the most desirable part of town anymore, you know?" No, I didn't know. I wasn't from around there. But it's safe here? I mean, really?
No one's ever bothered me when I've been here.
That didn't exactly give me warm fuzzies, but no one else was offering me a place to stay. I decided to not worry about what I had no control over, and instead focused on what I could control. What should we do today? Falcon laughed.
I don't know about you, but my top priority is making sure we don't run into any enforcers.
My lips curved into a small smile. Yeah, that's kind of our top priority too.
I also have to go to work in a couple of hours.
Oh, where do you work?
A place where people call when they need help with their computers. I do tech support.
I didn't like the idea of Amy and me being left here on our own for hours. What if Connor or Austin came back? They would recognize me, and then what? As worried as I'd been that Nick would turn Amy or me over to Holly, now the idea of his house seemed more appealing. Maybe if I had any idea of where he lived, or how to get there, I would consider going back. Then again, Scott had been captured by the enforcers. If he knew where Nick lived, the enforcers could torture that information out of him. If that happened, Nick's house would be less safe than this abandoned building. Then I thought, I just want to go home. The thought came to me unbidden, and as I pictured being with my family in our house in Timber Hills, I wanted nothing more than to be with them, safe and sound and left alone by enforcers. My overwhelming desire to make that happen forced me to acknowledge that it was up to me to make that a reality. But how? How long will you be gone? Amy asked.
6 or 7 hours.
Falcon turned to me.
Will you be okay here on your own, Raven?
I stared at him as 100 different scenarios of all that could go wrong paraded through my head, all of them ending with me in the hands of Holly. I don't know. He rubbed the back of his neck.
What if I sneak you into my brother's apartment and hide you in my room?
A list of pros and cons popped into my head. Pros? No Connor or Austin. No rats. No unexpected visitors. Cons? His brother could find us, and then what? Falcon must have read the indecision on my face.
My brother's probably not even home. He always hangs out with Cammy on Sundays.
He smiled.
No one ever goes into my bedroom, not unless I invite them.
That you know of, I thought. Still, that sounded safer than this place where anyone could show up. I turned to Amy. What do you think? Her face was pinched with worry. It might be better than here. I mean, in case those other boys come back. Glad to know my thoughts aligned with hers, I nodded, then looked at Falcon. All right, let's go to your apartment. Soon, the three of us began walking toward his apartment complex. I kept my hood pulled tightly against my head, and every time a car passed, my heart pounded, but we kept going. 20 minutes later, we arrived, and Falcon led us to a corner of the building.
Let me make sure Dylan's not there.
A few minutes later, Falcon came and got us.
Home sweet home,
he said as he held the door open for us. So, your brother's not here? Amy asked. Falcon smirked.
I wouldn't have brought you in here if he was.
Amy glared at him. Trying to smooth things over between Falcon and Amy, I said, We appreciate you giving us a place to hide out. Falcon shut the front door.
No problem.
Struck again by his unusual, eager willingness to help us out, I turned to him with a frown. Why are you helping us, Falcon? I mean, really? He stared at me.
I have my reasons, okay?
No, Amy said. That's not okay. We need to know why. He turned to her with a scowl.
I'm not going to tell you why.
His expression showed a challenge.
You can leave if you want. It won't hurt my feelings.
No, I said. It's fine, Falcon. You don't have to tell us if you don't want to. I gave Amy a meaningful stare that said, Don't make him mad or we'll end up on the street. She sighed, then turned her back on us. Where do you want us to hide? She asked.
Let me show you around first.
Falcon gave us a tour of the 2-bedroom apartment, ending at his room.
You can stay in here. If my brother comes home and you get scared, just go in my closet. It's a walk-in, so it's pretty big. I'll give you some water bottles and food to keep in there. You'll have to come out of the room to use the bathroom, though.
I went to the closet and peeked inside. It was plenty big for Amy and me. The apartment was comfortably warm, and I didn't fear random people would show up and find us, so I felt reasonably secure.
You can watch my TV if you want. Just keep the sound low, and if Dylan comes home, turn the TV off.
Okay. I sat on the bed, and Amy sat beside me. Falcon left us alone while he went to the kitchen to gather food and water. "I don't like this," Amy said. "It's better than that building, though." "I guess." She rested her forearms on her thighs. "What are we going to do, Morgan? The enforcers think you killed one of them. They're not going to stop hunting for you." Hunting. I hated that word. It made me feel like I was someone's prey, which I guess I was, but I didn't like to be reminded of it. The image of me crouching in a corner of Falcon's closet while a horde of enforcers stood outside the door with their guns drawn made me shudder in terror. "I don't know," I finally said. Since I didn't know if duplicate Morgan had actually killed Hansen, I didn't know how to prove my innocence. For all I knew, they had overwhelming evidence that it was her, which meant me. There was nothing I could do to change that. Despair settled over me like a thick and poisonous fog. I curled up on Falcon's bed, wishing with all my heart that I could just wake up from this unspeakable nightmare.
"We only had a few water bottles," Falcon said as he came into the room, "but you can refill them in the bathroom sink."
I didn't respond, but heard Amy take the bottles from Falcon. "I'll put them in the closet," she said.
"I found some power bars and crackers and stuff. I'll put those in the closet too."
"Thanks," Amy said. He stood there a moment.
"Guess I should get going. I'm off at 6, but I take the bus, so I won't be home until 7.
Then he left. I lay on the bed for a long time, eventually falling asleep. "Wake up, Morgan," Amy whispered in my ear as she shook me. "Wake up!" "What?" "Someone's in the apartment." Her words brought me fully awake, and I scrambled off the bed and into the closet with Amy right behind me. We softly closed the door and crawled into a back corner. "Who is it?" "I don't know," she said. "I heard the front door." "It's probably just Falcon's brother." "I know, but what if he comes into Falcon's room?" "Falcon said he won't," I said. "But what if he does?" She had a point. We knew nothing about Dylan, not even what he looked like. For all we knew, he searched Falcon's room whenever Falcon was at work. "We'll just stay in here until he gets home from work," I said. I tried to see Amy's face in the darkness. "Do you know what time it is?" "Last time I checked," she said, "it was 3:30. I'd slept several hours, but didn't feel at all rested. Instead, I felt groggy. "Falcon won't be home for hours," I said. Already, the closet walls seemed to be closing in on me, even though I couldn't even see them in the darkness. We sat together, completely silent, as the minutes ticked by. As boredom began to overtake me, my eyelids drooped, but when I heard Falcon's bedroom door swing open, my eyes snapped wide.
Chapter 27. "Are you sure he's not in here?" a male voice asked, mere feet from where I hid. "No, Dad," a voice that sounded very much like Falcon's responded. "I told you, he's at work."
That must be Dylan, I thought. My heart slammed against my ribs. Thank goodness Amy and I had hid in the closet. The thought of Dylan and his father discovering me sent my pulse skyrocketing. I had no idea how they felt about enforcers and fat centers, and I had no desire to find out. Amy's hand slipped into mine, and I calmed ever so slightly and thought, at least I'm not alone.
"When will he be home?"
The man, Dylan and Falcon's father, asked.
"I'm not sure, not for a while." "I haven't heard from him in well over a month."
The man sighed audibly.
"Is he still upset with me?"
Dylan laughed.
"When has he not been upset with you?"
The man chuckled.
"Right. Look," Dylan said, "you and I are on the same page, but he's more like Mom."
Dylan paused.
"Well, like she was." "I know," their dad said. "2 peas in a pod."
"What are you doing in town anyway?" Dylan asked. The bed creaked as if someone had sat on it.
"As you can imagine," their dad said, "things have been a little intense at work lately."
Dylan laughed.
"Yeah, I'll bet. The boss told me to get personally involved."
"Put the pressure on locally, huh?" Dylan asked.
"That's right."
The man paused.
"I decided to take advantage of the opportunity and see if I could see Jacob, try to talk some sense into him, make sure he's not involved with the wrong people."
Dylan chuckled. "Good luck with that." They were quiet.
"How are things with you, Dylan? Are you still dating that cute news girl?"
"Yeah," Dylan said. "Cammie's great." The bed creaked, and it sounded like whoever had been sitting had stood. "You know," the man said, the volume of his voice growing quieter as if they were leaving the room, "I'm a little concerned about that boss of hers." "Oh yeah?" Dylan asked. "Why's that?" I couldn't hear the man's reply. Instead, I heard the soft click of Falcon's door closing. It took several minutes for my heart rate to return to normal. "No one ever goes in his room, huh?" Amy whispered. My eyes had adjusted to the dark by then, and with the light from the bedroom seeping under the closet door, I could make out Amy's face. "I know." "I don't want to stay here, Morgan." She frowned. "I don't feel safe." Nowhere feels safe, I thought. Nowhere. "I don't know where else we can go," I said. "I don't know what else we can do." Tears of frustration sprang into my eyes, and my voice shook as I spoke. "I can't live like this." "Me neither," Amy sniffled. "I want to go home, Morgan." Her voice became ragged as she began to cry. "I want Mom and Dad. I even want Zach and Brandon." I pulled her against me and let her sob, silently cursing DM for what she'd done to our family. Our entire family was now suffering because of her. Fury boiled within me and I wanted to scream, but I held it in. Then a terrifying thought filled my head. Maybe I should turn myself in, just get it over with. No more hiding, no more living on the edge while waiting to be captured. Then hope and pray that public opinion will sway my way and the enforcers will let me go. Depend on Nick and his people to persuade everyone that fat centers are wrong and live on the hope that they'll be closed down. But as I listened to Amy quietly sobbing against my shoulder, I knew I couldn't do it. That was only something DM could do. I was too much of a coward. I knew it. I wasn't even afraid to admit it. It was the truth, and it was the only thing keeping me on the run. "When can we go home, Morgan?" Amy whispered calmly, her tears under control. "We can go home when it's safe, when we know the enforcers will leave us alone." She didn't ask any other questions after that, and eventually she lay on the floor and fell asleep. Hours later, when I heard Falcon's bedroom door open, I froze, afraid it was Dylan and his father again, and that this time they would find us. Amy was still asleep. I decided not to wake her. Why scare her? But when the closet door began to swing inward, I gasped, then pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the scream that wanted to escape. "It's just me," Falcon said softly. My breath came out in a rush, and my shoulders drooped in relief. "How are you, Raven? How's Hummingbird?" He stared at us. "Do you want to come out?" I pushed myself up and faced him. "What about your brother?" "He just left." My heart still beat in an irregular pattern, but I nodded, then woke Amy and told her Falcon was back. She stretched, then the two of us walked out of the closet. "I got something," Falcon said as he held up a plastic bag. "What is it?" I asked. He grinned like he'd come up with a brilliant idea. "A knob that locks, for my bedroom door." His grin widened. "No one can get in without the key." As much as I liked the idea, I wondered how hard it would be to break down the flimsy bedroom door. Then again, why would someone do that unless they knew I was in the room? "What about your brother? Won't he wonder why you're locking your door now?" "He knows I like my privacy. He'll respect that." "You had a visitor today," Amy said with a frown. "What?" Falcon's eyes went from her face to mine. "Yeah," I said. "We heard your brother come home, so we hid in the closet. But then he and your father came in your room looking for you." Falcon's eyes widened and his eyebrows rose. "My father? Are you sure it was my father?" "Well, your brother called him Dad, so—" "Oh." Falcon went to the bedroom window and pulled aside the curtain as if he expected his father to be standing on the sidewalk below. "It was hours ago," I said. He let the curtain drop back into place, then he turned to face me. "I'm really sorry, Raven. I didn't know he was in town." I shrugged, already over the idea of his father being in his room. The new knob he was going to install seemed like a decent deterrent to unexpected visitors. Soon enough, he'd finished installing the new doorknob, and when he turned the lock, I allowed myself to enjoy the illusion of security. This has been Dare to Prevail Part 2, Parallel World, Book 5. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2014 by Christine Kersey. The Other Morgan story continues in Dare to Prevail Part 3.